Hi everyone, welcome to Wandering Jews. Mijal here. I'm without Noam again this week as he has literally just returned to the US after a beautiful family simcha celebration in Israel. This week, I have the privilege of having another very good friend join me. I have here Dr. Tanya White.
So happy to be back.
Thank you. I'm so glad you're here. Wait, so Tanya, I'm just checking in. I feel like we haven't chatted for a while. What's new with you?
Good. All is good here. I actually was just reflecting on the situation here in Israel with a friend the other day. And I was saying, even though, I guess ostensibly the war's over, it feels as if we're only now beginning the recovery process. And I'm finding that so many of my friends and my kids' friends and, my oldest daughter's in the army. And I'm finding that we are only now beginning to process the last 2 years on so many levels.
Wow.
And I think there's just so much happening on so many different levels of recovery, but also of processing the events through the prism of and this, I guess, connects to what we're going to speak about. What story are we telling about this war? How are we do?
And there's conflicting stories. I mean, the Israelis of my feed are like, some wouldn't even use the word recovery yet.
No, I don't know if recovery is the right word. I would say I always use this analogy of, when a soldier's on the battlefield and they get shot, it's a known fact that they don't feel the pain because the adrenaline pushes them to run off the battlefield until essentially they get off the battlefield. And that's when the pain begins, right? That's when you begin to realize what
You
happened.
collapse.
Yeah. And I think that we've been on a battlefield in a very literal way and also in a metaphorical way over the last 2 years. And only now, once we've stopped, at least temporarily, even if it is, beginning to feel the pain and then processing that pain and how do you go about it and how do you begin the recovery process. But I think there's a whole nother dimension that's happening, and that is this what I've been calling the renaissance of the spirit, which is this kind of unreal renaissance of Judaism and Jewish values that is happening primarily actually in the secular world here in Israel. And
I
that
love how you say renaissance. Can you say it again? Is it like a British way?
renaissance.
Yeah. Yeah. No, it's beautiful. Love it.
And I feel that needs to be unpacked.
Right.
And I've been trying to do that through some of my writings and definitely through my teachings, but I feel that it's a whole dimension of something that's happening. We're literally living through something, some revolution of a spirit of some sense. And by the way, not in the classic sense, not in, Martin Buber has this brilliant essay, Religion and Religiosity. It's not in the classic religious sense of yeah.
I would say not. I'm going to just edit my own little gloss here. Not in the classic Ashkenazi sense.
Yeah,
I
you're 100%.
I think,
really agree with you.
and what Tanya is referring to, just for our listeners, there's been, I know as an outside observer, and I did visit Israel a few weeks ago, and I definitely sensed it there. But there has been this phenomenon of just a lot of individuals who would have self-identified as secular or not religious or traditional. And a big phenomenon after October 7th in the last years or so has been just more spiritual practice, more religious practice, more soulful kind of practices without necessarily re-identifying as part of the religious public in Israel or without having consistent religious public in all areas of life. In a way that I think is actually a bit different than this trend in which after October 7th, a lot of American Jews wanted to have more Jewish learning and more Jewish community. But I see a difference in the God speak that I think is more natural in Israel than here. So I haven't fully unpacked it yet.
Yeah, I the way that I see it is that there's classic religion or classic theology, which kind of brings God into the picture through our ritual behavior or the way we act in the world or our daily rituals and habits. And then there's another, and again, this Martin Buber would maybe call it religiosity, which is this spiritual awareness. I guess Avram Yoshua Heschel would call it radical amazement, right? this dimension of awareness that there exists some dimension of reality that transcends my immediate experience in the here and the now. That is what the hostages are talking about when they come back. And they said, we felt God when we were down there. Like one of, I think it was Elia Cohen came back and he said, I knew they didn't kidnap me because I was Elia Cohen. I
I
don't
think
know
it
who it was.
was Ram.
Maybe it was Rom. Maybe it was Rom. Yes, maybe it was Rom. Exactly. Okay. So he came back. He said, they didn't kidnap me because I was Rom. They kidnapped me because I am a Jew.
Yeah.
And at that moment, he said, I realized that my story wasn't as important and the story as being part of this meta narrative of this much bigger story. Now, this story of a people connected to God. Now, that's a kind of language that speaks to the spirit and not to the material reality of, what's in the here and the now. And to me, that is the kind of renaissance of an awareness that there's two people at play here in everything that's going on, and one is us and one is God. Um, and to bring God into the picture, even though, again, as you said, don't look classically religious or don't define themselves or identify themselves as classic religious terms, that to me is something really new. And as you said, maybe that's the difference between Ashkenazi and Sephardi. It could be as well, for sure.
Well, I see actually, I think that in a very classical Sephardi communal way, there was always this almost like ability to feel loved by God and love God and have a reverence for God and for the past, even if you didn't keep, ritual, and you didn't need to feel like the binary. Almost like my grandparents, bless me and kiss me, and I feel God through that, and it's something that's very organic. But Tanya, I love that I asked you what's going on, and you, of course, bring us into a philosophical exploration of this religious moment in Israel. That's, of course, it's very you actually. But let me take this to speak about Hanukkah, because
Yes.
we do want to talk about Hanukkah. And you gave me a little bit of a preview of the way that you approach it. And for you, one of the most important meta narratives of Hanukkah that has become timeless and timely also for us is one in which there is the triumph of maybe what you describe right now as like a God-infused dimension, in which there's something transcendent that we feel we are in partnership with beyond our here and now. Is that a way to encapsulate your approach to Hanukkah?
Yeah, I would take it one step further. I think it's not just the spiritual dimension and not just the materialistic dimension, but what I would call the covenantal dimension. And I think that the story of Hanukkah, we very often look at it in through three different levels or three different stories or three different narratives that have essentially been told over the centuries. And I think that it's important that we recognize that none of the narratives actually hold the whole truth. The whole truth is held. And by the way, that's the truth. That's the truth. That's true of any reality. Every reality has multiple perspectives, multiple dimensions, multiple narratives. Every person has multiple narratives. And often the narrative that we choose will define who we are, how we identify ourselves, and will define how we act in the world.
So let me make this less abstract and more concrete about
Yeah.
Hanukkah. So it's almost like if I'm writing about the Thanksgiving meal I just had, if I am an outside anthropologist describing it versus if I just lived it. And what am I going to tell my kids about what that looked like?
And I think it goes back to this idea that the Bible is not a book of history. It's neither a book of strictly law, nor is it a book of just history. It's actually a book of storytelling, because ultimately what sustains an identity, both individual and national, is the memories that we are made of. Okay, we know, for example, Oliver Sacks, the man who mistook his wife for a hat, right?
Mhm.
That meaning the saddest thing about someone with a disease, a memory loss disease like amnesia or whatever it happens to be, is that they're no longer the person they were, because what are we? We are an amalgamation of all of our memories, and the way in which we tell those memories, the way we pass those memories down, will define our story and the story of that's going to come after us, the story our children take from us. So the question to me about Hanukkah is very much about what story have we taken? What story have we adopted? What has become the mainstream story of Hanukkah? And what's fascinating is that obviously every holiday has different dimensions. You have the agricultural dimensions of the holidays, right? Of the Shlosh Regalim, the 3 holidays that we went up to the temple. We have the agricultural elements, and we also have the historical elements and the ritual elements. Every holiday has different elements. But what's interesting about Hanukkah is to understand that Hanukkah had at the time real life historians that were actually documenting the events. So you have, for example, the holiday of Hanukkah is documented in the book of Josephus. It's also documented in the book of Maccabees, which never went into the corpus of the Bible, but could have, right? It was debated whether it would or wouldn't. Um, and these books are documenting the events of what happened at the time. But then we have other sources. We have, for example, in the Talmud, the story, so to speak, the narrative of Hanukkah. And the story in the Talmud is the emphasis of the story is totally different to the emphasis that Josephus and the Book of Maccabees put on it. There's layers of narrative, and I would say even more than layers of narrative, there's a narrative journey that happens with a Hanukkah story, right? It's like, how is the story passed down in the collective consciousness of our people, right? To what degree do we emphasize certain parts? It's like any narrative that we're talking about. When I did the recording for the Rabbi Sachs podcast, Daniel Lubetsky, who's the founder of Kind Snacks, he was on Shark Tank. And he always talks about his father, who was a Holocaust survivor, who essentially always told his kids the story about how he was saved by a German soldier who threw him small pieces, scraps of bread every day. And Daniel says that him and his sister have this argument about his sister say to him, "You're emphasizing too much the righteous act of a Nazi soldier." And Daniel said, "I'm emphasizing it because that's what our father emphasized. That was the narrative he chose to tell, that even in the darkest of places where humanity was at its lowest ebb, even there was still people who were kind." And that's, by the way, why he calls his snacks kind bars, right? Because he said that is, we always need to find kindness. That's the way humanity survives, right? Which is fascinating. So again, where do we place the emphasis? And I think the collective story of our people, be it the Hanukkah story, be it whatever it happens to be, where we place the emphasis of the story is going to affect the way we perceive of ourselves and our agency and our role in this world.
Right. So Tanya, so let's do this. So there's one layer, one way of telling the story that is of contemporary or not contemporary, but very much more recent people who chronicled what happened in Hanukkah. So that's the books of Maccabees 1 and 2, and then the Jewish historian Josephus. The second layer would be the Talmud. These are rabbinic sages in the Babylonian Talmud, so they're already outside the land of Israel, living under foreign rule, and they are telling the story. What would be the third layer?
The third layer would be the liturgy, how it
Okay.
how it kind of manifests itself through our prayers, through our liturgy, and that is the Al Hanissim prayer, which we add in to grace after meals and into the Shemona Esrei, the
Silent meditation.
silent meditation prayer that we say. So that's added in during Hanukkah, and that also has a slightly different narrative to everything else.
Okay, so if you're going to go from these three layers, what would you say each of them is their narrative of Hanukkah?
So the first layer, which I would say is a more kind of, I guess, objective historical analysis, really emphasized the military battle, right? The story of what happened, which essentially is the historical, which I'm not going to go into now, the whole story, but they emphasize when they were looking here, I'm looking specifically at the part that I'm looking at here is the role of humans versus the role of God. Okay, that's really what I want to look at. Where did the redemption come from? Right? Did it look at the role of humans or did it look at the role of God? So when we're looking at Josephus and the historical analysis, there's no mention there of God. The reason why we light the menorah is that they found that obviously the temple was totally desecrated and destroyed, but when they went in to rededicate the temple, they couldn't find any oil to light the candles, the menorah, which was kind of the representation of what we would call the fire from below, meaning as human beings, we were mandated to light this fire from below. The fire from above, by the way, was the sacrifices, which, by the way, already by the Second Temple didn't really happen. Okay. So we were mandated to light this fire. They couldn't find even a small, it had to be pure oil. They couldn't find a small kind of jar of oil. Eventually they found one, and it was only meant to last one day. And in the end, it lasted for 7 days.
I wouldn't say, by the way, Tanya, that they were godless, because they did describe the religious aspects of the Maccabees and how much they kind of like fought for the glory of God, but they don't speak so much about God intervening.
Exactly.
You know,
Exactly. And by the way, there's no mention of the miracle of the jar of oil, which is also really important.
right.
And
I
you'll
think
see why it's important, because that's the only thing mentioned in the Talmud.
right. I
Okay.
did think I read somewhere that Josephus mentions the holiday as the holiday of lights, but he doesn't mention
He mentioned it as the
miracle.
holiday of light. And by
Right.
the way, it was also, and this is a whole nother discussion, but it actually happened during the time of Sukkot, because they had missed
Right.
Sukkot because of the battle.
Right.
So there's a whole connection here between Sukkot also being 8 days and Shmini Atzeret, which is, by the way, when the 7th of October happened on Shmini Atzeret, the 8th day of Sukkot. And I'm going to talk about that in a minute, because I think there's a connection here.
Right.
And the 8 days of Hanukkah. Now, the thing is, what is interesting is that the holiday itself is 8 days, and 8 in Judaism is supernatural. But we're going to come back to that, because that's why I said I think that what the holiday of Hanukkah brings to us is what I've called today what's happening in Israel, a renaissance of the spirit. And I think that the holiday of Hanukkah brought a new paradigm into the historical consciousness of the Jewish people, which I would call the covenantal paradigm of spirit.
This should blow listeners' minds, especially like in America, because so much of the way that American Jews celebrate Hanukkah is just focused on the little oil that lasted for 8 days. So the fact that it's not mentioned in the earliest writings should encourage us to study more. That's one way of putting it.
And there's a very, very big background to what's going on here, because it's not just about the fact that there was this military victory, which again, Josephus and everyone speaks about, but it's also about the fact that the Jewish people, especially the Maccabees, the Hasmoneans, they came about and they really turned around to a group of more pietist Jews who, until that moment, the Jewish response had been, if this is what God wants, we have to just kind of
Hmm.
provide no resistance to Antiochus, because God wants us to be under his,
Mm.
um, to surrender to him, because
Submit.
this is some sort of punishment from God. Okay, so that's kind of the more historical narrative, which again, as you said, mentions it was a holiday of light. Again, probably because it was in the winter at the time, or getting to the winter, and therefore that perhaps that was related. It might be that he knew about this myth, probably, of the light of the oil, but it's not explicitly mentioned in any of those historical sources. The second source is it takes a total kind of does a 180-degree turn, and that is the source of the Talmud. Now, again, as you said, why is this happening? There's definitely a polemic here. What happens is that after the Hanukkah story, the Hasmonean dynasty takes over the priesthood, and they become corrupt, because, as we often know, when religion and power go hand in hand, there is often a sense of corruption. Okay, as Rabbi
Okay, Tanya,
Sackler
let me
says.
just make this very sharp for our listeners. According to classical Jewish law, you cannot be like a king, a political ruler, and also the priest, which is the highest form of religious ruler. So this Maccabees that originally came to kind of like redeem Judaism from the rule of Antiochus, the Greek Antiochus, eventually end up themselves kind of like becoming corrupt, because they are priests and they become kings. They're holding both sides of power at the same time.
Exactly. And so ultimately the rabbis who came a few centuries later turned around and said, because of what happens in the long term, and the long-term failure of the Hasmonean dynasty, we need to emphasize here that it wasn't just the military victory that is the reason we're celebrating this, and the fact that we obviously won back a temporary sovereignty in our land, but it's the fact that God mandated this to happen. God helped us and allowed this miracle and this redemption to happen, meaning they wanted to to show that monopoly on redemption isn't just in the hands of human beings who ultimately can become corrupt, but it is in the hands of God. And God is the one really behind the scenes who is allowing this to happen. And therefore, the emphasis and the only narrative that they tell about the Hanukkah story is the narrative of the jar of oil that lasts for 7 days or 8 days instead of for one day. Okay.
So
And that's the miracle element. That's like oil, that's like fire from above. God is in charge. God is, it's, under his sovereignty that we gain our sovereignty.
right. Interesting, by the way, Tanya, because people give different reasons as to why the Talmudic rabbis de-emphasize the military victory and they really just talk about the miracle of the oil. So one of them is what you said, that they want to minimize the Hasmonean dynasty because of its corruption. Another reason that scholars give is that they are living as a vulnerable minority under Rome after the destruction of the Second Temple, after the failure of the Bar Kokhba rebellion, and they kind of, it's not, I'm going to say it simplistically, it's not safe for them as leaders of a minority community to be going around and being like, hey, look at us, we are celebrating the way we rebelled against empire.
There's
So
definitely
they
that
make it
element
into a
as well.
spiritual
100%.
victory.
100%. I think that's also a really, really important part. And again, it also shows how so many different how history and our narrative is influenced by so many different elements, right? Of our story, of why we tell the story we do. The third story, which I think is probably the most,
It's your favorite.
it's my favorite, okay,
Okay.
is the Al Hanissim prayer, which again is interesting because it doesn't talk about the miracle of the jar, of the
Yeah.
jar lasting for 7 days. It doesn't talk about that. It talks about the military victory, but it frames it in religious
Mm.
terms.
And this was composed, I mean, I think I looked it up at one point and I couldn't get the exact date, but it was composed like after the Talmud.
Yeah,
But it's
exactly. No, no, that's
post-Talmudic. We
exactly
don't know
right.
exactly when, maybe 6th century, 7th century, I don't know.
Yeah.
But post-Talmudic, we don't know exactly when.
Post-Talmudic, and which is also even more interesting because what essentially it's kind of done is to combine
Hmm.
both narratives together. It's kind of said, okay, let's lend some kudos to the historical narrative, and at the same time, let's also recognize that the rabbinic narrative is not 100% true to the real events. And again, this goes back to just to look a little bit at the story. What is happening before the whole story of the Hanukkah, at the time the Hanukkah story is that the Alexander the Great's conquest the Middle East, and he has brought with him this Greek culture, which is called Hellenism, which is has become very, very powerful, and a lot of Jews have become Hellenized Jews, and in terms we would use today, have become assimilated. Okay, and they are very taken by the kind of the trappings of this Hellenist culture, which is very much emphasis on the bodily form and on material existence in the world and etc. etc. Now, what's interesting is that the pietists, who are known as the Hasidim, it's like they're a small group and they essentially, obviously, totally kept themselves, were not influenced by Hellenistic culture. And when they saw that, and by the way, what's happening also is that the priesthood is also being influenced by Hellenist culture, and many of the high priests are being appointed by the Greek Empire, and they are being and they are corrupt, and they are bringing corruption. They are bringing this kind of Hellenist culture into the temple. Now, there's a big argument amongst all the different Jewish factions about how to resist the Hellenizers, and the Hasidim, the pietists, they're saying, we know that this is obviously God is challenging us. This is some form of punishment. And we have to just kind of, give in to what's happening. There's nothing we can do. We're not meant to battle this. We're meant to just understand that this is, in some senses, God punishing us, right? But you have this other person, this opposition faction, led by Mattatyahu and his sons from the Hasmonean dynasty. And they are turning around and they are saying, no, we realize that God is actually calling to us as human beings to go back to the biblical model. Now, what's the biblical model? The biblical model isn't that we just sit back and rest on our laurels and say God's punishing us. The biblical model is that we are meant to, together with God, fight for things to improve in the world. Okay, that is the biblical model of redemption. Isn't that God is just going to bring a miracle? That's what happened when we came out of Egypt. But ultimately, the biblical model is that together with God, and in fact, if you look at the parsha of coming out of Egypt, where God fights our battles and opens the sea, and the end of that parsha, where we see of that Torah reading, where we see that the people have to fight Amalek. Amalek being their arch enemy who come and attack them in the wilderness. And in that fighting, that battle, you have the people on the ground battling, and you have Moses standing on the top of the mountain with his hands risen in the air. And the Talmud there asks, did God make or break the battle? Like, what's going on here? Is it a miraculous battle? And the Talmud answers no. Just as long as the eyes of the people were looking up to the hands of Moses, they won and were victorious. And when their eyes were down, they lost. Meaning, and this goes back to the idea of a covenantal partnership, which essentially is what the Bible is. The Bible is about bringing a new paradigm into the ancient world, the paradigm where not just that we believe in God, but God believes in us, that we are not just, pawns at the hands of the capricious gods, right? But rather that we have been given a divine gift of human agency, that we can, together with God, partner with God to redeem the world. That was the model that Mattatyahu and his sons brought back to the fore. And they turned around and they said, wait, we're not just going to sit down and let things happen to us. We are going to be the agents of our own destiny, and we are going to do it exactly with the model of Amalek. We're going to do it with our fists and our weapons in our hands and battling on the ground, but with our eyes up to heaven, knowing that ultimately God is mandating us to fight this battle.
Right. So it's so interesting, Tanya. There's those who deny God. The world is just what we see in front of us, almost like the survival of the fittest, right? So like the stronger is the mightiest. There's nothing here beyond what we see. Maybe Greek culture might represent that.
Totally.
Then there's like a religious response that says we submit to God. We are passive as a way of accepting whatever God throws at us, right? And then you're saying the Maccabees and Hanukkah represent something that pushes back against both.
Exactly.
That says we human beings are going to be active partners and try to change the contours of reality, but not in a way that is godless, in a way that we believe God is helping us if we turn to God in the right way.
Exactly. I think you framed it exactly how I wanted to frame it. And I think even more than that, I would go one step further. If we know that Darwin spoke, Darwin and many people speak about the survival of the fittest. And if we look at the Jewish people, they defy all of those ideas. They defy the idea that we are here only, as Nietzsche said, the will to power, or as Darwin said, the survival of the fittest, right? In fact, actually, in Darwin's second book, he speaks about the idea that ultimately it's group altruism that is the most sustainable character trait for anyone, for any being in the world. But we're not going to get into that now. But what's interesting is that the Jewish people have defied all of those predictions because we are the smallest. We're definitely not the fittest and the strongest. Okay.
Big for yourself, Tanya.
So,
Just kidding. Just kidding.
no, I mean, but certainly also like even in terms of like just our numbers, think about our numbers. Like there's no reason for us to have survived all these empires. Like it just doesn't make logical sense if we're looking at it from a purely materialist way of understanding reality in the world, right? And so there's something about the Jewish people that is sustainable. Now, what is that sustainability? Now, again, I think it goes back to this idea of the spirit, that there's a belief and that there's a faith that we are not, and again, it's against the pietists, perhaps the more kind of passive religious posture, which says, I'm only going to believe in God to bring about redemption in this world, and there's nothing that I can do, and I accept my fate. It would cohere with what Karl Marx talks about, the opium of the masses, that religion is basically just saying, accept your situation, accept your standing in life, because this is all God's will, and there's nothing you can do to change it. And Judaism is a protest against that and that. And Judaism essentially comes in the middle. And this is really the biblical revolution. Very often we look at the Bible, we say it was a theological revolution from polytheism to monotheism. But the truth is that it was actually an anthropological revolution where we move from a world in which humans are basically seen to be passive pawns at the hands of the gods on one side, or if you want more, a kind of, I guess today you would maybe call it scientific fatalism, where you basically speak about the idea, well, we're born this way, there's nothing we can do to change it, or, this is what my DNA says, or this is the conditions which I'm born into and I can't do anything. And today, unfortunately, we're seeing it more and more. And that I call that survival of the right, not just the might. Okay, meaning
You don't mean right and left, by the way. You just mean righteous.
I mean right in terms of give me rights because I'm a victim of my circumstances, right? Like give me rights. Like I deserve to have all these rights because I'm a victim of my circumstances. And Judaism is a protest against both of these things because Judaism says that I don't need to accept the fact that I'm passive and I have no agency. No, Judaism says we are born in the image of God and therefore we are creators. We can be the creators of our own destiny, right? We can change ourselves, we can change the world. And Judaism does not buy in to a victimhood mentality. Judaism doesn't say, well, I've been given such a bad lot and there's nothing I can do to change it. And so I'm just going to demand everything from everyone to give me everything I can so I can remain within my victimhood. Judaism says we need to change our destiny. God has given us the mandate to work with him, meaning we don't defy the fact that there's another dimension of which we can't necessarily access all the time, but we can feel its footprints. There's a theologian who speaks about Neil Gilman. I think it's Neil Gilman. So he speaks about this idea of God's footprints in history. In my mind, I spoke last time about the idea of the invisible string, right? And I spoke about the idea that since October the 7th, Jews all around the world have felt the tug of this invisible string. In my mind, one of the most beautiful ideas that Hanukkah brings to the fore is because you could just see it as a festival of the fact that, we run a historical battle. That's essentially what the history books tell us. Or we can see it as purely spiritual. This was all God and humans had nothing to do with it, which is ultimately the polemic that the rabbis were trying to put forth because they were upset about the Hasmonean dynasty or they were worried about whatever it happens to be. But I actually think there's a middle ground, and that is, to my mind, the authentic biblical paradigm. And the authentic biblical paradigm says, I am a human being. God has mandated me with agency. I have a role to play in this world. I can bring redemption into this world, but I also have to always be conscious that God's footprints are in history, not just mine. And to my mind, that is detecting God's footprints in the narrative arc of Jewish history is the invisible string. That is the way I connect to my people at a very basic level. That's the way I connect to my people. And so to my mind, the story of Hanukkah has to be a story in which we tell both narratives. We tell the narrative of the miracle because that is detecting God's footprints in history. But we also tell the story of the battle, on the battleground, of the Gibor, right? Of the hero, right? Of the Maccabees as the heroes, of the story of the battle of the small over the many, right? All of those things that we talk about in Al Anis prayer, all of those things have to also be mentioned, and we don't negate the strength of human power, right? But we do it knowing that the strength of human power comes from its connection to the spirit.
Right. It's so interesting, Tanya, because you're really advocating for the liturgical kind of approach to Hanukkah, which is, I'm not even going. I think in my mind, what it's doing is it's redefining the idea of a miracle, right? Because the prayer is literally called Al Anisim, which means for these miracles that we're thanking God, but it includes in those list of miracles human feats. And my mind, the place my mind is going, is that I think in America, it's so interesting because, um, and I'm saying this without criticizing, for many reasons in America, a lot of the way that Hanukkah is celebrated is actually similar to Christmas, right? Like we've retrofitted Hanukkah as a celebration that American Jewish kids could do and feel proud of their holiday, as a minority population when Christmas basically takes over the commercialized Christmas. Um, but I think that there's something about that has also led kind of like us American Jews to almost only emphasize the kind of like supernatural miracle, right? You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Which is about like the little flask of oil lasting for 8 nights. And I think a big message or a big question for us is how do we reclaim? I think in Israel it's easier to reclaim. I'm just going to say this because you have in Israel a history of Jews in the last 80 years, 70 years, whatever, fighting, right? And actually seeing themselves as shaping through military feat.
Modern day Maccabees, basically.
Right. And a lot of Zionists love the story of Hanukkah because it was almost like a precedent for them of what they wanted to reclaim, after like the vulnerability of diasporic Jewish history. But in America, we don't have this. And I think part of what I'm asking myself and just sharing with our listeners is what does it mean for us American Jews to to reclaim the radical miracle of Hanukkah, which is not a miracle that is supernatural in a way that is devoid of human courage and bravery. So I think that that's the question that we need to really figure out.
So I think it's a really important question. And I'll just add to it that at the time, I think that there was a massive struggle to understand the significance and the religious dimension of this holiday, right? At the time, I'm saying, of this Hasmonean victory. And because it was marginal, because it was temporary, right? And because it wasn't long lasting, I think there was this real there was a contest of interpretive schema, which is the one that's going to be the ultimate narrative we're going to adopt. And I think even more than that, it was a sharply contested marginal victory, and because of that, the question was: is it really God's hand? Is it really a miracle?
Mm.
And so the rabbis emphasize, yes, it was a miracle. It was God's hand. And the battle itself was a miracle, even though it was at the hands of human beings. And it was the hands of human beings, which was, again, was a sharply contested paradigm even at the time, right? And if I think about now what's happening in Israeli society, it's like history is repeating itself because you have one group of people who are saying, well, if we just concentrate and learn all the time and close ourselves in the bubble, God will save us. We don't need a big army. In fact, we don't need to go to the army.
You're talking about Haredi
I'm talking
Jews.
about the Haredi Jews, the Haredi outlook versus the modern Orthodox and secular outlook. The Haredi outlook is we're not going to the army because we need to sit and
God
learn
will
because
provide.
God will save us. We don't need an army. Okay?
Right.
And you have the modern Orthodox Jews who are saying, but hold on a minute, you can have both. You can believe in the Spirit and in God and in learning and in Torah and say that this is what God wants us to do. He wants us to be his partners down here on earth. He doesn't want us to wait for a miraculous victory that's supernatural. He wants us to bring the Spirit into the dimension of the material, of the everyday, of the here and the now. And I think that maybe America is more binary, like this binary way of looking at religion, that religion has to fall into the category of the supernatural, of the miraculous, and everything else can fall into the natural. And Judaism says, no, it's actually got to be an organic whole. And can we make space for the spirit, even in the dimension of the material?
Right.
And that's
Part
what
of-
the Hasmoneans teach us.
Part of what you started with, Tanya, was actually mentioning that in Israeli society, there's been a shift now, that it's not only a dialogue or conversation between, Haredim and modern Orthodox or religious Zionists. There's now a whole trend of secular Israelis who are, in their own way, finding the spirit and God in a way, again, that is not the let's just say like the Orthodox way or whatever, but it's actually also an attempt to move beyond the binaries. Let me just ask you very quickly. Um, when I was in Israel, like Hanukkah time, my favorite thing was walking around and just smelling the bakeries everywhere. So
Well, I have 4 celiac kids, so we ain't got none of those
Are
nice.
you celiac? Can you eat
I'm not,
zucchini?
either me or my husband, but I feel it's terrible. We can't bring these amazing rolled-in donuts.
I have been watching little TikTok reels of, I don't know why the algorithm is targeting me. There's this guy who has like a bakery in Jerusalem and he just creates this stunning, beautiful baked goods. So I have just been missing Israel
Literally,
by
that
watching bakers in Israel make the most stunning, not just pretty, but they look like they
I
taste, they
know,
look
it's
like
an
they
art.
taste good.
It's an art. It's
Yeah, so
literally an
now,
art.
so you don't want to make me more jealous by telling her.
I haven't even gone into a bakery yet because if I go in, I'll end up eating that. It's like it's my that's my like my sweetness is
Okay. What about like latkes, which in Israel they call levivot,
yeah, yeah, and we love latkes in our house. We make
because that's what you can eat basically.
exactly,
Good.
exactly. Wait, I just wanted to finish with one thing, which
Sure.
I'm going to finish with, and I just realized that my light's gone out, but doesn't matter. Okay, which is this idea, which I think is absolutely fascinating, is that if we look, the 7th of October happens on the 7th of October, but it actually, and the 7th of October, number 7 in Judaism generally is nature. Everything natural happens in sevens, right? 7 is the days of the week. It's like nature. But in Judaism, 8 represents the supernatural, meaning 8 is a dimension of the spirit. It's something that we can't quite grasp. It's something that's above the cognition of humankind. It's something that's transcendent in some way. And to me, it's fascinating that on the 7th of October, it was the 8th day of Sukkot.
Hmm.
Okay. Now, the 7th of October is natural. According to the natural law, okay, we should not be around. The Jewish people shouldn't be around. We are surrounded by enemies, and one of those enemies came across the fence and basically tried to destroy us. But what we showed on Shmini Atzeret on the 8th day, okay, is that we are above nature. On the 8th day, we came together against Darwin's prediction of survival of the fittest. We came together with absolute altruism, with compassion for our people, even though we had literally been ripping each other apart before the October the 7th with all the infighting that was happening. And on the 8th day, we showed that the reason we have survived as a people is because when push comes to shove, we will feel that invisible string no matter where we are and no matter what we are doing, we will come together as a people. And in my mind, that's what the Hanukkah story reminds us. Yes, we fought the battle, and if we're looking at it purely from a historical naturalistic lens, right, like Josephus does and whatever, then okay, we won, and it was an amazing victory, right? But it was amazing because just somehow this strategy or the tactics of war were better for the Jews than they were the um for the enemy. But on when we look at it through the lens of God's footprints in history, we realize that there's something more happening here. And that spirit that is within us, it's God's spirit. It's the spirit of the Jewish people. It's the idea that there's something, another dimension above what's given in the here and the now, that is imbued and literally inherent within all of us. And that spirit allows us to come together and to survive and to win and be victorious of the battles over our enemies, even when all the odds are against us. And so we're looking, and by the way, it gives me hope today, Mijal, especially I know in America you are struggling. I know we've been speaking about it. I think Jews in America now and in Israel, everywhere Jews are struggling with the reality that we're facing. But one of the things that I keep reminding myself of, and Rabbi Sachs speaks about this, is that faith is the belief in the law of possibility over the law of probability, right? And ultimately,
It's a beautiful
that is the spirit. That is the dimension of the spirit. So to me, what the Maccabees reminded us is that we don't just rely on miracles and spirit, and we don't just rely on kind of the material dimensions of the here and now. We combine them together into this paradigm of covenant where we recognize that God has given us a spirit within ourselves. And when we tap into that spirit and we connect with our people, we are able to transcend any given reality.
Beautiful. Thank you so much, Tanya. I love it. I mean, you say you're not a theologian, but this was a lot of lot of theology in the best of way. But just always love chatting with you, Tanya. Thank you again for a really
Thank you for inviting me.
thought-provoking conversation. For everybody listening, happy Hanukkah. I'm Mijal Bitton. This has been Wandering Jews. Until next time.